It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Good. Glad to be back.
Glad you can join us again. We're also in the company of freelance reporter Catherine Field.
Good evening.
Quiet week?
Not where I'm from.
All right, we'll ask more about that in a bit. Rosie Calera, staff reporter for sister station Radio France International. Nice to see you.
I see you too.
And France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons.
Hello.
How are you, sir?
Good.
The World This Week on Facebook and on Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. You can call it peacemaking or you can call it damage control. Donald Trump dispatching his vice president to Turkey to broker a ceasefire or a truce or a cessation of hostilities. Whatever you want to call it, it follows a cross-border offensive that was born from the U.S. president's decision to pull his troops from the area. We're talking about a 32-kilometer deep buffer zone that effectively, with this truce, recognizes Ankara's decision to push out the Kurds and replace them with Arabs. And while the EU Council president says it's not a ceasefire, it's a demand of capitulation for the Kurds, it's now how the U.S. president, it's not how the U.S. president has seen it on the campaign trail. Donald Trump speaking Thursday in Dallas, Texas.
We've gotten everything we could have ever dreamed of, and we're also going to be able to bring our people back home, but we'll be able to have control of ISIS total. We'll be able to do whatever we have to do to get the rest of ISIS wherever they may be. They're never going to be ruling us. And I want to thank everybody. And the other thing I want to thank, as a group, I want to thank the Kurds because they were incredibly happy with this solution. This is a solution that really, well, it saved their lives, frankly. It saved their lives. So we've done a great thing for our partner.
How's life-saving going so far, Christopher Dickey?
Not so well. The ceasefire is already falling apart. In fact, Turkey won't even call it a ceasefire. It's just a pause. Basically, the deal was that the Kurds should withdraw from all the territory that they fought for years and lived in for generations. There's a whole question about what's going to happen to Kobani. Do we remember the Battle of Kobani?
Yeah.
Where the Kurds were the only thing that stood between ISIS and control of the Syrian border with Turkey?
And did they get any help from the Turks?
Absolutely not. The Turks were literally standing with their arms crossed, watching them get killed. And I was reviewing our coverage of that the other day, and it's just incredible. The Kurds held out. We're looking at some of the most. They may have all kinds of ideological problems, but they are some of the bravest fighters around, and that's why the Americans supported them. And I think they are going to continue to fight, and I don't think that they were happy with the deal that Donald Trump came up with, which was basically a complete capitulation to the Turkish point of view.
A deal which they weren't a part of.
Well, I mean, the extraordinary thing about this deal is, why is the United States in there trying to do a deal with Turkey anyway, when effectively the United States has withdrawn from the region in any case? As far as the Kurds are concerned, they have no right to be negotiating on their behalf. They've just been stabbed in the back by the United States. It's extraordinary to see the two key figures in the U.S. administration acting as if nothing has happened, as if the United States was still in the position it was a week ago. A week later, everything has changed as far as the United States' strategic position in Syria and in the Middle East as a whole. And to pretend otherwise is absolutely ludicrous. The position on the ground has changed completely. The United States cannot negotiate, for instance, for the Syrian government or for Russia. They will regard this deal that's been struck between the United States and Turkey as worth nothing. Why should they? They already have their forces on the ground.
No, the real diplomacy is going to come in Sochi when Erdogan meets Putin.
Yeah, that'll be next Tuesday, Catherine Field.
Yeah, it will be. And it just will highlight even more who's now running the show in the Middle East. The Russians have taken over. They've pushed the Americans aside. And they are there. And it's happened under Donald Trump's watch. It's happened live on TV in front of all of us. We've watched it happening.
Yeah, your reaction to this tweet earlier in the week, Donald Trump saying, anyone who wants to assist Syria in protecting the Kurds is good with me, whether it is Russia, China or Napoleon Bonaparte. I hope they all do great. We're 7,000 miles away. Now that last sentence, we're 7,000 miles away, is the one that matters because he's saying effectively, this doesn't concern us.
Well, let's just think maybe if the Kurds happen to attack, whether by accident or whatever, Turkish troops on the Turkish side of that border. Turkey is a NATO member, is a NATO ally. What if that happens and then Turkey then implements the "we've been attacked, please can all our allies come to our..."
Article 5.
Yeah, Article 5. What happens then? Well, America is not 7,000 miles away. America will be asked to come and help. And with all that's going on in that area at the moment, everything's up in the air. There is nothing that we cannot say now, oh, that won't happen. That's
Except that we know Donald Trump's opinion on Article 5.
And I think that's the only person who's ever invoked Article 5. Or the only
and that's what this underlines, I think, is the weakness of NATO, but also the weakness of Europe and the three European powers in particular, Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel and Macron. Macron's come out today. He's very angry, isn't he, at basically what he calls this madness, and the madness being that NATO is in no position at this point to intervene. So both the weakness of NATO and the weakness of the European
And they say they
Union.
want to have a unified position, but it doesn't look like it's going to be in time. Yeah. What could Europe be doing more though at this point?
Well, I think that ultimately that's the sway that America's had until now over Erdogan, isn't it? There's the threat of sanctions, and I think the threat still exists. I think the congressmen next week they're promising to impose or at least propose even deeper sanctions on Turkey, and I think that's the problem that Europe has had is as a sort of unified unit is to put the pressure on Erdogan. I think that they've been speaking individually to him, but I don't think they've been able to, because I think that's ultimately what...
In defense of Donald Trump, you could say he's successfully weaponized the dollar. We've talked about this often, and people don't like to send troops abroad.
Sure, but the dollar is a very slow-moving instrument, and Turkish troops are very fast-moving troops. The whole objective of Erdogan is to create facts on the ground, and then we'll deal with the sanctions issue later. But he wants to create those facts on the ground. Donald Trump has already acquiesced to all intents and purposes. And Donald Trump actually doesn't want to impose sanctions on Turkey. He's just trying to recover from his own idiotic move in removing really the very small number of troops from out of the way just to give Turkey a green light.
And the sanctions he's imposed were, frankly, ludicrous as well. They were pinpricks.
Well, the whole thing is ridiculous. Everything is ridiculous, but it's all his effort to save face, especially when he realized at a time when he's being impeached by the House of Representatives that even his staunchest backers in the Senate, like Lindsey Graham, are saying, this guy is dangerous, this guy is crazy, this policy is insane. That's not the kind of thing you want to hear if you're Donald Trump right now from your strongest supporters.
All right, to prove he was serious, the White House releasing a letter this week to Erdogan where Trump says, quote, "Don't be a tough guy, don't be a fool. You don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy, and I will." That's a letter that's turned heads, by the way, as far away as places such as Moscow.
You don't often see such language in correspondence between heads of state. It's a highly unusual letter.
Highly unusual letter. As a former Moscow correspondent, Robert Parsons, what do you think the Russians make of all of this?
Well, I mean, the Russians find it extraordinary, there's no doubt about it, but they're very happy because they're seeing an American president who's effectively playing into their hands, who's demonstrating again and again that his word can't be trusted, that he can say one thing one day and something completely different the next, that he's got very limited idea about international affairs, very little understanding about how states interact with each other, and no sense of the United States' strategic purpose.
If Christopher Dickey is right, that there is the factor that the erratic, if you will, decision-making is partly due to the fact that he's distracted by what's going on with the impeachment hearings. what do foreign powers think? If is it going to get more and more erratic as the impeachment process heats up?
Well, I think so. I think that the expectation of Donald Trump has long been that he's going to get more and more erratic. He's done nothing to suggest otherwise. He's distanced himself from people who can give him sound advice. And so the expectation is that you have to expect anything from him. And the danger, as I was suggesting earlier on, is with the impact that has on the United States allies around the world, because they look at Donald Trump or this administration now and say, look, this is not an administration whose word we can trust.
I think the point that you make is that when this letter first came out were there really no grown-ups in the room?
Yeah.
Before, clearly these types of letters have been drafted before, but there's been someone else in the room, someone else in the outer room, someone who read these types of letters. The fact that I don't know how many people would have let that letter go past before it reached the rubbish bin in Erdogan's office.
It's unbelievable.
It's also dangerous. I mean, there's no way that Recep Tayyip Erdogan could read that letter and not feel that he was being called a fool.
Yeah.
And I've met him a couple of times, and I can tell you, I've never seen anybody so jealous of his own dignity as Erdogan is. And it's interesting, you look at the date on that letter, it's October 9th. So probably it went through, Erdogan saw it or heard about it on the 10th. That was about 24 hours before the Turks accidentally lobbed shells at American bases, at an American base, bracketing it on each side. Gee, I don't know. Do you think that might have been a signal?
All right. The situation in the Middle East, which will continue to unfold again next week with that meeting in Sochi between the Turkish and Russian presidents. We're going to turn our attention, though, to a date that's much closer, Saturday. Now that he's got a divorce deal with Brussels, the UK Prime Minister can turn his sights on Westminster and sell the prospect of a happy ending to Brexit.
And now is the moment for us as a country to come together. Now is the moment for our parliamentarians to come together and get this thing done. And, as I say, to begin building a new and progressive partnership with our EU friends, with whom, of course, we share so many priorities.
Rosie Clear, they all lived happily ever after?
To be seen tomorrow, obviously, in this vote in Parliament. And then today, I've understood that he and his advisors there in 10 Downing Street are furiously trying to meet with undecided Labour politicians or MPs, and then also with, remember, the 21 that he expelled from his own party, the Conservative Party. Then the hope is really that he's really got to bring some of these people, the undecideds, into the fold to win this vote tomorrow.
All right, the UK finds itself in an unusual situation. A government that on paper is 45 seats shy of a majority. Yet, as you say, Saturday's vote could nonetheless, even though these 45 votes shy on paper, could swing either way. This is a tally that was done by the Financial Times. It was on Thursday, just after the deal was struck in Brussels. The ink was not yet dry. And they came up with 318 for, 321 against. Possibly, they say. They're very cautious themselves. Could it really be that close? And could it really swing either way?
I mean, he's got to get 320, hasn't he? And as I say, I think that what's certain, obviously, parties like the DUP are going to vote against, but I think
or abstain. Even that's
abstain,
unsure.
Yes, yeah.
Well, do they vote against or do they abstain?
Well, let's see. Tomorrow we'll know. Yeah.
Why is it so close, Robert Parsons?
It's so close, essentially, because the DUP are not going to vote with the government on it. This is the problem. But he's got the deal, but to get the deal, he's had to alienate the DUP by saying that effectively there's going to be a customs union that goes down the Irish Sea. That's the concession he's made to the European Union to get this through, but it's completely unacceptable to the Democratic Unionist Party, hardline, right-wing Protestant party. Most closely associated with the phrase "no surrender," and that's their position on this as well, I'm afraid.
But there's talk of a sweetener, perhaps some kind of a package, perhaps money.
I don't think that's going to play.
You don't think it's going to play?
Not with the unionists, no. That'll take a lot more than that to get the unionists to budge.
Do you agree, Catherine Field?
Well, I think what they might listen to are the small businessmen or the small businesses in Northern Ireland who say, look, this actually won't be so bad for us. If we can keep doing business across the border, that might not be so bad. But, full marks to Boris. I mean, he got the deal there. Yeah. He got it over the line. Amazing tactics. I think he's really touched a nerve when he said, we've had enough of this. Let's just get this done.
I think that's it.
And that has been the thing, even though people still do not realise what's coming down the road. They do not realise this is just the withdrawal agreement. This is only the start. We're going to be Brexiting.
But have we underestimated Boris Johnson?
I think we have.
I think for this one we have. He has clearly shown that he has got the strategy, the tactics, he's got the buzzwords.
But also he's got charm, and this is what Conservatives will tell you, whether the party members or MPs, is that he has an incredible amount of charm, and he's very much liked within the party. But also, of course, remember the MPs, a lot of them have obviously gone through Eton and Oxbridge, and so, they'll be friends across party lines too, and he has this rapport that I think is, that he doesn't do justice to that rapport in public, because of course he likes to do the bumbling buffoon Boris.
I'm not sure he works with Ulster Unionists.
No. Yeah. But either way, he's going to win. If it gets through the House of Parliament on Saturday, he'll be the winner. If it doesn't get through, he'll be able to say, look, once again, I'm being held up. The Parliament cannot decide. It's pulling me back. I came. I got a good deal. Look at me. And he can sell that to the party. And the party will say, yeah, it's great. As you say, he's got the charisma. He's got the party behind him, whichever way the vote goes on Saturday.
And it is, as you're saying, Robert Parsons, it's not the same deal that Theresa May had negotiated. There is a difference.
Yeah, because he's taken out the backstop clause, hasn't he? And then interestingly, of course, the DUP are unhappy about it, but also what I think is interesting, the SNP, so the Scottish Nationalist Party, even more unhappy about it, because they feel it elevates, it gives Northern Ireland an elevated position, and ultimately, to the advantage of a place like Scotland.
All right, what happens to the UK? We'll ask our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us, as is Catherine Field, freelance reporter. Catherine, New Zealand versus Ireland?
It is.
Prediction?
Ireland have beaten us twice in the last 3 times. So.
That's not a prediction.
No, I think we'll walk it.
All right. France, Wales?
Wales.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Let's say hello to Rosie Collier. Rosie Collier from Radio France International. Welcome back. And to Robert Parsons. Scots are out of it.
I'm sorry about that.
Parsons from the International Affairs.
It was a happy day for Japan.
Right, it was indeed. Rob, the great thing about Brexit is we're 24 hours away from this vote, and we have no idea what's going on.
Well, I'm not sure whether that's a great thing, but yeah, it's true. We have no idea at all. And
so wait, first of all, what are they going to vote on Saturday? Because even that is not clear.
That's not even clear either, because they will be allowed to vote on a series of amendments tomorrow, including one by Oliver Ledwin, which sort of turns things on its head, so that you vote on the legislation which will enact the withdrawal bill before you give an approval on the bill itself. That takes time, and because it takes time, the Benn Act will come into play, which means that.
The Benn Act, which forces him calling for a delay beyond October 31st.
Exactly. So the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will have to go to Brussels. By law, he'll have to go to Brussels and ask for an extension. He may not necessarily be opposed to that, because this does not mean that when it comes to the vote on the withdrawal bill itself, he will lose the bill. In fact, one could argue that he might have more of a chance of getting the bill passed and turned into an act if that were to happen. And he would also have the possibility of then going to the people and saying, look, this is where we are. It's clear where I stand on this is the withdrawal agreement I've come up with. I'm going to the people on this issue now. You can look and see what Labour are offering. Vote for me. And there is every chance that he would win a pretty big victory in the
Let's look at
elections,
what Labour are offering. Mixed messages from Jeremy Corbyn, its leader. A definite no when it comes to approving the divorce deal that was sealed in Brussels when they vote on Saturday in the Commons. But the whip won't be withdrawn from MPs who cross the aisle. In other words, they can vote what they want. Also, gone is talk of tying the divorce deal to a measure that would require its approval by referendum.
As it stands, we cannot support this deal and will oppose it in Parliament on Saturday. And it also is unclear if he has the support of his allies in the DUP or indeed many of his allies on his own backbenches.
Will you be backing a second referendum on Saturday?
It won't come up on Saturday, I suspect.
It won't come up on Saturday, this call for a second referendum. But wasn't that at the Labour Party conference one of their demands?
Yes, it was. And I think that probably the big worry for Corbyn at the moment is a prospect, the possibility of a general election. And I think that's one of the reasons that he's saying he won't use that whip, because he doesn't want to alienate his own party ahead of that possibility, I think.
Or he's not that bothered about whether or not there's a Brexit, which has been the accusation.
All along, of course, because he is himself a Eurosceptic, isn't he? So that could be behind it.
All right, so the Labour Party tearing itself apart and the Conservative Party coming together. It seems even those 21 who were kicked out, many of them say that they will be voting for this deal, Christopher Dickey.
Yeah, I expect they will. I mean, I think, as we said before, the fatigue factor is going to weigh very heavy tomorrow. I think people are just tired of this stage of the Brexit development and would just like to get on with the next stage.
Yeah, although the extraordinary thing is, sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, please, Rob.
But the last 50 polls on whether or not the UK should leave the European Union have shown consistently that everybody wants to stay in now by a majority of at least 6%. But who cares about that?
Well, why would you care about that? I mean, especially if you're the Tories.
Yeah.
50 polls now.
Well, why? I mean, that's just the popular will. Why would you care about that? I mean, what was the popular will that made Boris Johnson the prime minister?
But it's intractable, isn't it, for decades? Because, again, a vote that was 52 to 48, 48% of the population unhappy, you can never get around that.
Well, and they'll probably be more unhappy when they start to actually feel the effects of Brexit. Yeah. But, Britain started on a path of lies down this course into Brexit, and then the Tories embraced it for whatever reasons. And the charismatic Nigel Farage, now head of the Brexit Party, has forced the Tories further and further and further to the right. I mean, really, if you look at it, the best friends that the Tories have, the reason they stay in power is because Jeremy Corbyn on the left is such an implausible candidate and has been so erratic.
But you heard Boris Johnson in that clip we played earlier talk about a progressive partnership going forward with the European Union. He managed in Brussels to sound like a moderate.
Boris will say anything. I mean, it's one of the characteristics of Boris Johnson that he's a terrible liar. He makes things up all the time. He was thrown out of his journalistic job for making up quotes. Come on.
And I think this is what also...
people like him for it as well.
Yeah, it's charming.
And the fact that he is unreliable. You're unreliable. I think that's one of the things, isn't it, that's forced Oliver Letwin to come up with this idea of an amendment, is because I think there's growing concern, even within the Conservative Party, that should Britain leave the European Union, which obviously it looks like it's going to, with or without a deal, that the concern, I think, increasingly is that, the European Union, ultimately, it protects labour rights, also ensures a certain environmental standard of operation for businesses. And ultimately, I mean, there's a sort of a term now being used in Westminster that talks about Singapore on Thames. So ultimately, Britain having really, below par substandards in the way that it operates, and it protects labour rights. So that's I think is people are beginning to wake up of what Britain outside of the European Union could look like.
Well, Singapore.
Britain is a giant tax haven.
I mean, it's a giant tax haven. Well, they've got a lot of practice at all sorts of dodgy dealings, not just in the city of London. It's a fallacy that to believe that one day to the next you can be like Singapore with low taxation, great social welfare, the whole thing. It's just a fallacy.
We're talking about what used to be called Great Britain. Wants to be like this little island down in South Asia.
It just will not work. And the fact that this has been pumped up, it's been backed up with this really nasty, vile, xenophobic chant against the Europeans, thinking that Europeans are holding them back. Well, and let's also not forget another angle that's going to come up in this is that Britain will still be there. The UK will still be there. So we're not going to have some fancy Franco-German axis running Europe because France has got very close links with the United Kingdom. It's both militarily, economically very combined. Both of them have got permanent seats on the Security Council, big military. So we're always going to be dealing with the UK in some way or other.
So it'll be the EU without voting rights.
Yeah, and they'll have given up this fantastic position as a member of the EU with more rights than anyone else, more out than anything. Extraordinary thing. Free trade across the most powerful, the biggest bloc in the world that they ever had, but they wanted more.
All right, and this 48-52 divide. It conjures up images of another bitter division that's once again playing out on the continent this Friday. Catalonia erupting anew since Monday. The Spanish Supreme Court handing down 9 to 13-year sentences to a dozen leaders of a failed 2017 independence bid. And while separatists block airports, rail lines, and highways. It was mostly peaceful this Friday, but turned violent as night started to fall with a general strike. The separatists making their voice heard, but they're not the only ones. Here, far-right sovereigntists on Thursday chanting, "We are Spanish, we are Spanish." And again, Catalonia is divided. And the rekindling of the violence and anger of 2 years ago coming smack in the run-up to a snap general election next month, Catherine.
Yeah, this is the one aspect that we always forget when we talk about Barcelona, Catalonia, is it's a very pluralistic society. It's not just 95% Catalonians who are saying, listen, we need our rights. It's a very mixed population, very diverse. And it was just a few hours ago, in fact, that the Spanish Prime Minister, speaking just before he left Brussels at the summit, he said, look, we do now have to coexist. You cannot have the situation continuing particularly in Barcelona.
So you have Pedro Sanchez who's been saying that there's going to have to be a political solution to this problem. It's not going to happen in the courts at the end of the day.
Unless the police overreact this weekend. This weekend, with all these demonstrations, it could all change on a dime if the police... There's some sort of mess up on the police. A demonstrator is killed, something, and that could really change.
It's only day 5, but there's much more violence, it seems, than 2 years ago.
Much more violence than 2 years ago. But remember, the 2 years ago, it was all constructed around the vote that was being held, and the violence that was seen was actually at a voting place, and it was much less than this. But also, people have learned that violence attracts attention. There were huge demonstrations in Barcelona, and we're not showing footage of that. We're showing footage of about a couple of dozen people throwing Molotov cocktails. This is a problem everywhere, and it tends to take mass demonstrations that are an expression of public opinion, whether in Hong Kong or France or Catalonia, and turn them into expressions of random violence by anarchists in many cases. I think that's a mistake. I think what was impressive here in Catalonia was mass demonstrations, and I think what's impressive in Hong Kong is mass demonstrations. And I wish, frankly, that we wouldn't always be showing people throwing rocks and lighting tires, because you don't need many people to do that.
All right.
It's not an expression of public opinion. That is important.
Yeah, this was part of the general strike. Rosie
But
Kalir.
the tactic has definitely changed. I was there in 2017. I spent a bit of time. I was on a sabbatical, so I spent 3 months down there, not as a reporter, funnily enough. So really got to sort of observe what was going on.
As opposed to when you're a reporter.
You have to file all the
You're in the
time.
thick of it, with the people throwing cocktails. But ultimately, at that point, it's mass demonstrations, but also, they take the form of, you'd hear in the evening sometimes people on their balconies just tapping on saucepans and things like that. It was, so it's a big, but forever present. You've also always you'll see in Barcelona the flags flying from people's windows, and then of course since their leaders were arrested and now have been convicted, then call for sort of the freedom of their political leaders. But I think the sentiment has definitely changed in the last few days, in a sense that they're targeting, for instance, Sagrada Familia, the big UNESCO World Heritage cathedral there, as we're seeing on the screen now. That's closed to the public. On just a few hours after the conviction of those 9 leaders on Monday, also a good number of demonstrators immediately went to El Prat Airport to try to block off Terminal 1
Hong Kong
there.
style.
So Hong Kong style, you're absolutely right. But ultimately, I think that maybe a core of the protesters have understood that they need to aim to shut down parts of that massive tourist economy that Barcelona has. And so there has been a definite change.
And to give you a sense of just how much the mood has changed, Catalonia's current president, himself a moderate separatist, thought he had the solution on Thursday.
If holding our own elections for self-governance means we will be sentenced to 100 years in prison, then the answer is clear. We will need to go to the ballot box again for self-governance.
He proposes another independence referendum, Robert Parsons, and he gets clobbered. He gets clobbered, obviously, by the sovereignists who say, no, we're Spanish. And he gets clobbered by a good portion of the separatists themselves, saying, no, we already voted once. It was in 2017.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, that the lines are so sharply drawn now in Catalonia itself and between Catalonia and Madrid that it's very difficult to get enough space to really make a deal here. And I don't think that this decision that was taken by the courts in Madrid has helped things. One could talk about the independence of the judiciary system and so on and so forth, but it does rather smell to me that like a political decision.
Is that what hurts things the most, or the fact that Madrid can't find a working coalition to negotiate?
No, I don't think it's really a question of finding the coalition to negotiate.
Spain doesn't have a government.
The lines are so sharply drawn at the moment. And as Catherine said, the problem at the moment is within Catalonia itself, they're so sharply drawn that, to find a solution to that problem is going to be unfair to one side or the other. It's rather like the UK over Brexit, 48-52.
Intractable.
You could have a referendum tomorrow and it would be the other way around. And on both, one side or the other is going to be a very large disgruntled population.
Well, there's also the rural-urban divide, too.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
But when you're talking about cosmopolitan Catalonia, you're actually talking about cosmopolitan Barcelona.
Yeah.
Whereas the heart of the independence movement is small towns. It's a provincial city.
And they're very small. We all look at Barcelona and think the rest of the province is like that. It's not at all.
And the same with Scotland at the moment as well. 50% in favour of independence, but 50% are opposed.
Yeah, and no split there. If, as Christopher Dickey was saying just a few short minutes ago, the name of the game is to draw as much attention as possible to your cause, well, the jury split over the 2-week worldwide civil disobedience campaign by the environmentalists of Extinction Rebellion. Now, getting celebrities on board? Fine. In this instance, iconic fashion designer Vivienne Westwood outside the UK office of oil and gas giant BP. It's different, though, when you try to disrupt Thursday's morning commute in East London.
You are happy, Kaz? You're happy?
I'm really not. That's why I'm doing it.
It's a road. The world is not coming to an end.
Now, that activist is okay. He had to be defended by London Underground staff on the Jubilee line in Canning Town. Rosie Clear, your reaction to that?
Pretty shocked, actually. I've just seen it today. But ultimately, I also watched some of the exchanges of commuters with some of the Extinction Rebellion reporters. And, ultimately, one woman said that she's just trying to get to work. She doesn't understand all this. And Canning Town is a very working class part of the city, where people, as I say, will just be going to other parts of London to try to work. And I think also what that exchange that we've seen also shows is the kind of identity of the Extinction Rebellion activists. They're very much seen in Britain, but I've also heard it said here that they're sort of middle-class provincials. If you speak to some of them, as I have done here in Paris, they don't come from Paris. They come from other parts, and I think that was a clash of those two identities in Canning Town yesterday. Ultimately, I think a lot of working-class people who busy just trying to make ends meet, sort of see these environmental
The Paris was
hippies.
shut down the other day too. I mean, it's not just in London. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is an international movement, and it was shutting down roadways and commuter lines.
So earlier you said they've realized there's no such thing as bad publicity when we're talking about Catalonia. Yeah. In this case, we have heard some contrition from Extinction Rebellion activists saying, no, we shouldn't target the trains, since the trains are what we should be encouraging people to do. Did it go too far that time?
Well, I think it has gone too far, yeah. But I think the other problem is that the message is still a message that has to get out, and it's a message that has to reach the highest levels of government. I mean, I'm basically sympathetic to what Extinction Rebellion is talking about, just as I was sympathetic to Greta Thunberg's statements. I think people have to listen, and there has to be much more than sort of hand-wringing and tokenism on the parts of governments. But do I want to get stuck in traffic for hours because of Extinction Rebellion? No.
It's not going to make you happy, is it?
And everyone laughed, didn't they? Was it earlier this week or last week when someone glued themselves to a British Airways plane at Heathrow? And it was, yes, we should be worried about the pollution from airlines. And yes, it must have been only the rich that were travelling. And that was sort of okay. But as Rosie says, this is rush hour in London. It's bad enough having to use public transport in London at rush hour. Without someone middle class out of town.
You're not going to win much sympathy by doing that.
But how do you wake people up? And I think it was interesting this time last week, they were outside the BBC's offices in central London, New Broadcasting House. Also that they blocked it for a good couple of hours, apparently. Staff couldn't get in or out. And the reason they'd chosen that particular location is because they feel that their message isn't being represented well enough by the media. So...
Well, I think the debate about climate change and what we should be doing is much further along than it was, say, a year ago. And I think they do need to make that distinction of where it was a year ago, when, let's face it, a year ago, no one talked about we're using too much plastic, when there wasn't this debate about whether we should be paying more tax on airline fees. So the debate has gone further, and I'm not one to defend the BBC, but even the BBC has now stopped allowing climate change deniers on TV. So the message has to change, and we're all moving along. Just stay off the top of commuter trains at rush hour, please.
That'll be the final word from Catherine Field, who hopefully by Sunday will change her mind regarding the rugby. Robert Parsons, I want to thank you as well. I want to thank Rosie Clear, Christopher Dickey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Does anyone on social media have an opinion regarding Saturday's proceedings in the House of Commons?
Just one or two. Yes, there is a lot of discussion online, and cartoonists, not just in the UK, but around the world, have been getting certainly plenty of mileage out of this. I think this is one of my favourites, Andy Davey in the Evening Standard today. And you'll notice the car, which is exceedingly clapped out, has Deal of the Week, almost new. A nod to the fact that a lot of people are saying this is basically Theresa May's deal with just a couple of little tweaks. I'll state my honour on this one, Governor, says Boris Johnson. A lot of people feeling that he's plays a little fast and loose with the truth, shall we say. This one comes from the Dutch cartoonist Joop Bertrams. I love this. I don't know if it's coincidence that it looks like the Joker or if that's intended, but he's basically pulling a dead rat out of the hat as opposed to a rabbit, as magicians are supposed to do. So yes, that is a particularly...
Or a fatigued rat.
Well, I think there's a bit of blood around the eyes. He doesn't look too good. I would say that's a dead rat, an ex-rat perhaps. But anyway, a lot of people wondering really whether there's much difference. This is Ingram Pinn for the Financial Times, basically literally having Boris Johnson trying to force it through the Houses of Parliament, this particular deal. One theory that's gaining a lot of traction is the idea that this is all about securing a no deal. It's got nothing to do with the deal itself. A lot of people talking about this, partly because certain MPs have been hinting at this too. It sets us on a path to no deal after the transition period, just like Article 50 did, only without the escape hatch of remaining instead. Now, that's from the writer of Slaying Brexit Unicorns, so we know where he stands on this.
Yeah, and just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Well, indeed. Sam Gyimah, who was a Conservative MP, got kicked out for trying to block no deal. He's now a Liberal Democrat, says voting for Johnson's deal is voting for no deal in a year's time. But what do the wider public make of it? Because a lot of these people are analysing every single change, every single word when it comes to Brexit. YouGov has done a new poll. It's not exactly resounding, but 41% of the general population want Boris Johnson's deal to be accepted. 24% don't. It's clearly much, much higher when you look at Leave voters. 67% of them want them to go ahead with Boris Johnson's deal. So that's an interesting one. Curious take on it from a Telegraph journalist, Kate Borsay, who says, taking the temperature, the majority, 41% of Britons want Boris Johnson's Brexit deal to be voted through Parliament on Saturday. I'm not sure that 41% has ever amounted to a majority. I always thought it had to be over 50. Maybe I'm getting a bit old with my maths. So yes, lots and lots of talk about this one, and including criticism of the media for talking too much about will it pass and not enough about should it pass.
Guilty as charged.
Sorry about that.
All right. And here in France, we have, yet again, this is a recurring theme, the divide over bullfighting. Bullfighting, which is popular in the south of France.
Yes, sadly. I'm going to nail my colours to the mast right now and say where I stand on La Corrida, as they call it, or bullfighting. The latest hoo-ha has been created by almost 40 personalities, in inverted commas, who wrote a letter that was published in Le Figaro, which says that the bullfighting is an art and nothing should be banned. Now, they go on to say that France cannot embody this dismal, retrograde Puritanism. It all sounds a little bit like the criticisms of the Me Too movement that many people in France didn't seem to want to accept. Now, the best-known person to be commenting in this particular letter is Jean Reno, the actor, of course, famous for Léon. But what's worth noting is that we're not talking about actually banning it, an outright ban. What Emmanuel Macron's party wants to do is actually ban under 18s from attending. So it's about protecting minors from very gruesome scenes, basically. Not too many people share this view, but some do. This gentleman saying completely in agreement. It's the most beautiful, magnificent art form. But note that he does actually use a very civilised image there, which is not like many of the other images being posted online. If you want to just watch horse sport, go and watch a dressage competition. That would be my advice to this person. Lots of people, though, including animal charities, saying this is torture, it is not an art form. And some of the comments are certainly worth taking a look at. Bullfighting is not an art, but an open-air butcher's shop. It is shameful. One of my favourites on this one, though, I think is this one. This gentleman saying that he respects their point of view, but he calls on each of the 38 people who signed that letter to actually take the place of the bull, because after all, they said it was all about a meeting of courage and honour.
Right. Many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.